Welcome back to the deep dive, everybody. Today we're going deep into the philosophy of biology.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, and I know you, the listener, you enjoy getting a solid grasp on all kinds of subjects. So I think you're going to find this area especially rewarding.
I think so too.
Yeah, we're going to be exploring some truly fundamental questions about life itself.
That's right.
We'll be drawing from the philosophy of biology entry in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy as our guide.
Perfect place to start.
Yeah, and we're going to try to extract the most compelling ideas from this and understand why thinking philosophically about biology is so crucial,
Right.
all without getting bogged down in a bunch of academic jargon.
Right, exactly. Make it fun.
Yeah, make it fun, make it approachable.
Yeah, and what's really interesting right off the bat is how philosophy and biology have sort of come together.
Yeah.
It's really been pretty recently.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I mean, while philosophers have long considered the sciences, the serious engagement with biology, it's been a phenomenon largely of the last 50 years or so,
Yeah. I see.
which kind of mirrors the growth and importance of biology itself.
Oh, that makes sense.
So it's a big field.
Yeah.
We're going to focus on the core areas.
Give us a strong foundation.
Exactly.
So to kind of get our bearings, the entry points out that philosophical inquiry in biology tends to cluster around three main types of questions.
Right.
The first is when philosophers take those big general ideas from the philosophy of science and see how they specifically apply to biology.
Yeah, like cause and effect,
Ex-
or how different scientific theories relate to each other.
Yeah.
So using biology to kind of test and refine those general theories of how science works.
Oh, I see.
About scientific explanation, the nature of laws,
Yeah.
different levels of organization.
Yeah. Okay, so that's a pretty broad one.
It is
Yeah.
very broad.
The second type of question seems a bit more focused on within biology itself. Philosophers here really dig into the fundamental concepts and ideas that biologists use all the time and try to understand them more deeply.
Right. So like, what do we really mean by fitness
Exactly.
in evolutionary biology?
Yeah. Biologists use terms like fitness all the time.
All the time.
What does that actually mean?
Philosophical analysis can really help us unpack that.
Yeah.
Identify any hidden ambiguities
Yeah.
and make them more precise
Right.
to make sure that the tools are really sharp and well-defined as possible.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
And then the third category is where philosophy looks to biology for insights that might help us with those really big, enduring philosophical questions.
Right.
The ones that aren't necessarily about science.
Yeah, ethics.
Yeah, ethics or how we understand knowledge or even the nature of consciousness.
Exactly. And biology, as the science of life, kind of bumps into a lot of those core questions
Yeah.
that have occupied philosophers for centuries.
Totally.
Like, can evolution shed light on the origins of morality
Oh, interesting.
or the nature of the human mind?
Yeah, that makes sense.
That kind of thing.
Okay, that's a good breakdown of those three.
Yeah.
And it's also important to remember that, biology isn't just one thing.
Oh, of course not.
You've got everything from studying tiny microbes to, understanding vast ecosystems, digging up fossils, engineering new forms of life.
That's right.
It's a huge field.
It is huge, and each area brings up different questions.
Yeah, that's what the entry emphasizes too.
Right.
Each of these areas within biology raises its own unique set of philosophical puzzles.
Exactly.
So how does studying the deep past,
Right.
with paleontology, where the evidence is often fragmented, how does that lead to philosophical questions?
Well, yeah, different than the ethical considerations that come up in biotechnology.
Right, totally different.
Yeah, so much is changing so quickly.
So before all this, more recent surge in interest, was there just not much philosophical work being done on biology?
Well, there was what we might call a prehistory.
Okay, a prehistory. Yeah, but entry mentions that.
It does. There were definitely some early signs.
Okay.
We can look back to the 1950s
Okay.
to a biologist named J.H. Woodger
Okay.
and a philosopher named Morton Beckner.
Right.
They both published some really important books that grappled with philosophical issues in biology.
But it didn't really lead to much else.
Right. It didn't immediately lead to more widespread philosophical engagement.
I see.
The reasons why are a little unclear.
Yeah, maybe a little ahead of their time.
Possibly, yeah. There were also philosophers of science who made some pretty broad statements about biology,
Oh, okay.
just from a more general scientific perspective.
Okay.
A striking example is J.J.C. Smart.
Okay.
Back in 1959, he claimed that biology wasn't really an independent science at all.
Oh, wow.
more like a practical application of physics and chemistry.
Really, so like a branch of engineering almost.
Yeah, he even used the analogy of radio engineering. His point was that biology doesn't discover any new laws of nature. It just shows us how the existing laws play out in living things.
So studying a bacterium is fundamentally no different than studying a transistor.
That's the essence of his argument.
Wow, okay, interesting.
And that idea that biology might not have its own unique laws has been a recurring theme
Oh, okay.
in these philosophical discussions.
Makes sense.
So a lot of debate about that.
Yeah, yeah.
Whether there truly are laws of biology that can't just be derived from physics and chemistry.
Okay, so even in this prehistory, there were definitely philosophical questions being raised about biology.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah, even if it wasn't a recognized subfield yet.
Right.
The entry also mentions Ernst Mayr
Oh, yes.
and his complaint that philosophy of science at the time was like totally focused on physics.
Yeah, he had a real frustration.
Yeah.
That philosophy of science was really biased toward the physical sciences,
Okay.
and that the unique characteristics and challenges of biology were just being ignored.
Yeah,
So he really pushed for biology to get its own philosophical attention.
that makes sense.
Yeah.
But there were some philosophers already engaging with biology, right?
Yeah, of course.
I mean, Carl Hempel and Ernest Nagel,
right.
they're mentioned in the context of teleological explanation.
They are, yes.
Now, what does teleological even mean?
So teleological explanation refers to explaining something in terms of its purpose or its function.
Okay.
So we might say the heart is for pumping blood,
Yeah.
right? That would be a teleological explanation.
I see it. Okay.
And they offered some analyses of how those kinds of explanations could be understood within a scientific framework
Okay.
without resorting to mystical or vitalistic ideas.
Yeah. Okay. So even before the field took off, there were some seeds being planted.
Absolutely.
So what were the key factors that really led to the growth of philosophy of biology as its own distinct area of study?
Well, the entry highlights a couple of really important elements.
Okay.
Encouragement from prominent biologists like Mayr himself
Wow.
and F.J. Ayala.
It's absolutely vital.
Okay.
Recognizing the need for philosophical engagement
Yeah,
gave legitimacy to the field.
makes sense. Yeah.
And then there was a group of philosophers of science at Harvard
Oh, okay.
who were interacting with leading biologists like Stephen Jay Gould, Richard Lewontin,
Wow. Okay.
and Richard Levins. So that exchange was really productive.
Yeah, the philosophers bringing their analytical tools and the biologists bringing their knowledge of the living world.
Absolutely, that synergy
Yeah.
was really fertile ground for new ideas.
And a major landmark was the publication of David Hull's book
Yes, Philosophy of Biological Science.
in 1974.
1974, exactly. The fact that it was published in a major philosophy series
Yeah.
signaled that it was becoming mainstream.
Okay, so this is a field in its own right now.
Yes, exactly.
And then the growth since then seems to have been really rapid.
It has been.
I mean, Robert Brandon,
Yeah.
he talks about knowing only 5 philosophers of biology in the late 70s.
And then all of a sudden, so many more. And then so many more.
Yeah, and journals.
Dedicated journals? Wow.
Dedicated journals.
Yeah. Biology and Philosophy in 1986.
Right.
And then others that followed.
Yeah.
Wow. So we've got a sense of how the field emerged.
Right.
Now let's dig deeper into those 3 main types of philosophical inquiry.
Okay, sounds good.
Let's start with applying general philosophy of science ideas to biology.
Let's do it.
The early debate about reductionism and genetics.
Right, perfect example.
What was the central point of contention there?
So this was a really foundational debate.
Yeah.
As molecular genetics started to reveal the mechanisms of inheritance at the level of DNA.
Okay.
The question was whether classical Mendelian genetics, which focused on the inheritance of abstract genes, could be reduced to this molecular level?
So could we explain everything Mendel observed
Right.
just by understanding DNA?
Exactly.
Right.
A philosopher named Kenneth Schaffner
Right.
drew on something called the logical empiricist model of theory reduction, which basically suggests that simpler, more fundamental theories should logically explain more complex ones.
Okay.
And he argued that such a reduction should be possible,
Okay.
that the concepts and laws of Mendelian genetics could be derived from molecular genetics.
So we could throw out the idea of the Mendelian gene
Right.
and just talk about everything in terms of DNA.
That was the idea, yeah.
Okay, but then David Hull disagreed with this.
He did.
What were his reasons?
He argued that Mendelian genetics was operating at a different level of explanation,
Okay.
more abstract.
Yeah.
It was concerned with the patterns of inheritance across generations
Right.
and how traits are passed down
Yeah.
without needing to get into the specific molecular mechanisms.
Okay.
He felt that it captured generalizations about inheritance that weren't immediately apparent at the molecular level.
So it had its own explanatory power.
Exactly.
That couldn't just be replaced by molecular explanations.
Right?
So different levels of analysis, each providing valuable insight, but not necessarily reducible to the other.
Exactly.
Okay.
And this debate actually influenced how philosophers thought about the relationship between different scientific disciplines.
Really?
Yeah, it contributed to a growing consensus about the autonomy of special sciences.
Okay.
So fields like biology, psychology, economics, they study complex systems at their own level.
Yeah.
And they have their own laws and concepts
Right.
that can't always be neatly translated into the language of physics or chemistry.
I see, but the story didn't end there, right?
No, it didn't.
The idea of complete irreducibility also seemed problematic.
Yeah.
And so they developed more nuanced models of reduction.
Exactly. Because
Yeah.
molecular biology was explaining so much about life
Yeah.
that complete irreducibility seemed counterintuitive.
Yeah. Yeah.
So philosophers started to develop more sophisticated ways of thinking about reduction.
Okay.
These new wave models acknowledged the connections between levels,
Yeah.
but didn't require a strict logical derivation
I see. I see.
of higher level theories from lower level ones. Got it. So thinkers like William Wimsatt, Paul Griffiths, Sahotra Sarkar, they all contributed to this.
Okay, so it's a much more nuanced view.
Yeah, much more nuanced and complex.
Let's move on to the second type of philosophy of biology,
Okay.
analyzing conceptual problems within biology itself.
All right.
The tautology problem regarding fitness sounds particularly tricky.
It is, yeah.
Can you explain what that is for those of us who aren't evolutionary biologists?
His is a puzzle that has challenged evolutionary theory for a long time.
Okay.
J.J.C. Smart, who we talked about earlier,
Yeah.
pointed out that the statement, the fittest will survive, seems kind of empty.
Yeah.
If we define fitness simply as those who survive.
Right. It's circular.
Yeah, it's a tautology.
Yeah, it doesn't really tell us anything.
It doesn't.
It's like saying those who are best at surviving are the ones who survive.
Exactly.
Okay.
And if fitness is just defined in terms of survival,
Yeah.
then natural selection seems to lose its explanatory power.
How can it explain differential survival
Right.
if fitness is just another word for it?
Exactly. So that's the problem.
Okay, so how did philosophers try to escape this loop?
Well, some argued that fitness was a fundamental concept
Okay.
that couldn't be broken down further.
All right, like an axiom almost.
Yeah, thinkers like Alexander Rosenberg and Elliot Sober
Mm-hmm.
proposed that it gets its meaning from its role in the theory.
I see. I see.
So if it's an undefined term,
Yeah.
the statement, the fittest survive, isn't a definition.
Right.
It's a principle
Yeah, okay.
of the theory.
Okay, that's one way to resolve it.
It is.
But then the entry mentions a different approach.
Right.
With supervenience and propensity.
Right. This approach offered a different way to think about it.
Okay.
So first, they argue that fitness is a supervenient property.
Okay, now what does that mean?
So think of it like this. The wetness of a towel depends on the water molecules.
Okay.
But wetness itself isn't a molecule.
Right.
An organism's fitness isn't an independent entity. It depends entirely on its physical characteristics and the environment.
Okay, so fitness isn't just a label. It's rooted in the physical attributes and how they interact with the environment.
Exactly. And the second key idea was to define fitness as a propensity,
Okay, a propensity. Now, what's that?
a probabilistic tendency,
Okay.
or a disposition
Mhm.
to survive and reproduce in a certain environment.
Mm-hmm.
Think of it like rolling a weighted die.
Right.
A die that's weighted to land on 6 more often has a higher propensity to roll a 6,
Okay.
but it won't roll a 6 every time.
Right, right.
Similarly, a very fit organism has a higher probability of leaving more offspring
Okay.
than a less fit organism.
Over the long run.
Yes, over the long run.
But not necessarily in every single instance.
Right.
Got it. So the dice analogy makes it a lot clearer.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, so the fittest survive isn't a tautology because fittest refers to this underlying propensity,
Exactly.
not just the actual outcome of survival.
Right. So while it's linked to reproductive success, it's not a circular definition.
Okay, got it, got it.
And that lets us make predictions about outcomes.
Yeah, but the entry also mentions that there's still debate about how to specify those probability distributions for fitness.
Right. The propensity view is widely accepted,
Yeah.
but it's still tough to mathematically model and measure these tendencies.
Yeah, to actually capture all the complexity.
It really is. Yeah, so it's an area of active research.
Okay, so it's not a settled issue.
Not completely, no.
Now, the entry broadens this discussion of conceptual problems beyond just fitness,
Right.
and it talks about how philosophers contribute to ongoing biological debates.
Yeah, like the species concept.
The species concept, that's a big one.
It is. It's very lively.
Yeah.
This question of what exactly is a species.
Yeah. Is there a single definition, or are there different ways to define species?
Right, for different organisms or for
Oh.
different research purposes.
Yeah, so philosophers have actually been really involved in this,
They have.
trying to clarify those different criteria
Yeah.
that biologists use.
Yeah.
Yeah, the ability to interbreed, shared ancestry, ecological role.
Right, and exploring the implications of adopting one concept over another.
Yeah, so it seems like philosophy isn't just passively observing biology.
Oh.
It's actually contributing to how biologists themselves think about their work
It really is.
and define the objects of their study.
That's right, and that can have practical consequences.
How so?
How we define a species can impact how we do biodiversity surveys,
Oh,
understand conservation efforts, even interpret evolutionary history.
wow. Okay.
Yeah, so it's really important.
And the entry also highlights the role of philosophy of biology as this mediator between biology and society,
Oh, yeah.
especially in evaluating these popular interpretations,
Right.
which feels super relevant today
It does, yeah.
with so much information out there.
Right. It's easy for the public understanding of biology to get oversimplified or distorted.
Yeah, leading to all sorts of misunderstandings.
It does.
So philosophers can help
Yeah, with their skills and critical analysis. Yeah.
and promoting a more accurate understanding of the research.
Right, and the specific examples given, the debates around creationism and intelligent design and sociobiology and evolutionary psychology, those are areas where philosophical analysis has been essential
It has.
to separate scientific reasoning from agendas.
Exactly. So philosophers have helped to clarify the scientific status
Yeah.
of those claims and offer critical perspectives on some of the more deterministic or reductionist claims that have been made.
Okay, so keeping things grounded
Right, keeping things grounded.
in the science.
Exactly.
Now let's move on to the third type.
Right.
Appealing to biology and broader philosophical discussions.
Sounds good.
Biological teleology is mentioned as a key example.
Right.
We touched on this earlier, the idea of purpose or function.
Yeah.
How has biology influenced the way philosophers think about this concept?
So teleology has a really long history. Goes back to Aristotle.
Okay.
But with the rise of Darwinian evolution and the modern synthesis,
Biologists moved away from this idea of inherent, divinely ordained purpose.
yeah,
Instead, they started using the term teleonomy,
teleonomy.
to describe the apparent goal-directedness that arises through natural selection.
So it's not that evolution has a plan,
Right.
but natural selection can favor traits that look like they have a purpose.
Exactly, because they help survival or reproduction.
Makes sense.
And in the 70s, philosophers started to look at this evolutionary understanding of function to see if it could provide a more scientific foundation for normative concepts.
Okay, so normative concepts, what do you mean?
Concepts about what ought to be,
Oh,
like health and disease.
okay, so using evolution to define illness.
Right, to try to ground it scientifically.
That's a really interesting idea.
It led to the selected effects theory of function.
Okay, tell us more about that.
It argues that the function of a trait is the activity for which it was selected for in the past.
Okay, so the heart's function is to pump blood,
Right.
because that's why hearts were selected for
Exactly.
in ancestral populations.
Right.
Okay.
That's the idea.
And this idea of proper function
Yes.
has had a big impact on other areas of philosophy,
has.
like philosophy of language and philosophy of mind.
It has, yeah.
How so?
It's become a way to try to understand intentionality,
okay.
like the way our minds can be about something
yeah.
and meaning in language.
okay.
Philosophers have argued that the meaning of a word or the content of a thought can be understood in terms of its proper function.
What it was designed to do by evolution.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So a neural representation in the brain might have the proper function of representing danger
Okay.
because it caused evasive action in the past.
Right.
So it was selected for.
I see. So our capacity for thought and language isn't just random.
Right.
It evolved for specific functions
Right.
that helped us survive.
That's the argument, yes.
Okay, so grounding mind and language in evolution.
Exactly.
Okay, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
Now, the entry also brings up this idea that evolutionary theory might debunk certain moral views.
It does, yeah.
How does that argument work?
So some philosophers argue that if our moral beliefs evolved because they enhanced survival and reproduction,
Yeah.
then there's no guarantee that they reflect moral truths.
Okay.
So just because a moral belief was fit
Yeah.
doesn't mean it's actually morally correct.
Right, right.
So this raises some tough questions about our moral judgments
Yeah.
and whether they're just a byproduct of evolution.
Wow, okay.
Yeah, it's a big one.
So our sense of right and wrong might just be an adaptation,
That's the argument.
not connected to any universal moral principles.
It's a bit unsettling,
It is. It is.
but it's a profound idea
Yeah.
that's still being debated.
Okay, now the entry moves on to discuss the philosophy of specific areas in biology,
All right.
highlighting this incredible diversity within the field.
Yeah, biology is a very diverse science.
So let's touch on a few of these just to illustrate that diversity.
Sounds good.
Philosophy of life seems like a natural starting point.
Yeah, where do we start?
Yeah, that fundamental question, what is life?
Right.
It seems like something we should know, but it's surprisingly tricky,
It is. Even Aristotle struggled with this one.
really.
Yeah, he thought maybe self-motion was a key characteristic.
Okay.
But when we try to come up with a list of necessary and sufficient conditions,
Right.
we run into problems.
We find exceptions.
Exceptions, yeah, sterile worker ants.
Okay.
Alive but don't reproduce.
Right.
Crystals can grow and exhibit organization,
Yeah.
but we don't usually consider them alive.
No. So trying to define life by a set of rules doesn't seem to work.
Right.
What are some of the alternative ways of thinking about it?
Well, one is to focus on exemplars
Okay.
or prototypes.
Right.
So instead of trying to define it precisely,
Yeah,
we point to examples and say that things are alive to the extent that they resemble these examples.
I see.
Another is definitional skepticism, suggesting that the category of life might just be too diverse to be captured by a single definition.
Especially if we consider extraterrestrial life.
Exactly. We might have to completely rethink what life is.
Yeah, yeah.
And then there's pluralism,
Okay.
which says that maybe there isn't one correct definition,
Yeah.
but several legitimate ones,
Okay.
each useful for different purposes.
Okay. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Now, what about artificial life?
Oh, that's a good one.
The attempt to create life.
Right. It makes us think about the essential properties.
Yeah, yeah.
Strong artificial life proponents
Yeah.
argue that if we can make something,
Yeah.
like a computer program
Okay.
that can self-replicate or evolve, then it's alive.
Right.
Skeptics say that these artificial systems might lack something crucial
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense.
that biological life has.
Okay.
And then weak artificial life
Yeah.
is more about using computer simulations to study life,
Okay.
not necessarily claiming to create it.
Right. Right.
And of course, the origin of life
Yeah.
is tied up with how we define it.
Yeah, totally. Totally.
Really interesting stuff.
Okay, let's move on to philosophy of evolutionary biology.
Yeah.
The entry notes that this has been one of the most philosophically engaged areas.
It has, yeah.
Why do you think that is?
Well, evolutionary biology provides a really powerful framework for
Yeah.
understanding the diversity of life
Yeah.
and how it's adapted.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's a theory that has a lot of complex concepts
Right.
that have implications for other areas
Yeah,
and for philosophy itself.
totally.
So debates about the mechanisms of evolution,
Yeah.
the nature of natural selection,
Right.
random genetic drift,
Controversies.
like sociobiology and adaptationism.
Yeah, yeah.
All of these things have generated a lot of philosophical interest.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Now, Elliot Sover's analysis of population genetics,
Right?
using the analogy of Newtonian mechanics,
Yeah.
sounds like a really good example of using philosophy to study evolution.
It was groundbreaking work.
Okay.
Yeah. It clarified the different forces that can cause changes in gene frequencies.
Okay.
But this forces view has also been challenged.
Really?
Yeah, by those who prefer a more statistical approach.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
Yeah.
And this distinction between natural selection and random genetic drift,
Right.
it's not always so straightforward.
It's not always so simple, no.
Yeah, I mean, we think of natural selection as being driven by advantageous traits,
Right.
and drift as being due to chance events.
Right.
But distinguishing between those in the real world.
It can be really hard.
Yeah.
So philosophers have been working on ways to define these processes
Okay.
and look at the causes between traits and changes in gene frequencies.
Okay, and those controversies surrounding sociobiology in the 70s and 80s
Yes.
and adaptationism,
Right.
They also sparked a lot of debate.
They did a lot of debate.
What were the philosophical issues there?
So the sociobiology debate raised questions about using evolutionary principles to explain human behavior. Critics like Gould and Lewontin argued against what they saw as too much genetic determinism
Okay.
and not enough attention to culture and environment.
Yeah.
So the adaptationism debate focused on whether natural selection is the primary driver in evolution
Okay.
and whether most traits are adaptations
Oh.
for specific functions.
The philosophers really helped to clarify the different types of adaptationist claims
They did, yeah.
and evaluate the evidence
Right.
for and against them.
Exactly.
And the ongoing units of selection debate.
Yes, a big one.
Genes, organisms, groups. What is the primary unit?
It's a question that's generated a lot of discussion.
Yeah, okay.
Going back to Williams and Dawkins,
Right.
early debates were about the level at which selection operates
Okay.
and the criteria for determining that level.
And more recently?
More recently, there's been work on multi-level selection,
Okay.
where selection happens at many levels
Let's at the same time.
at the same time.
Okay.
And this has led to a resurgence of interest in group selection.
Okay, so the debate's still going.
It is, yeah.
Okay, now let's touch on philosophy of systematic biology,
Right.
which deals with classifying organisms
Right.
and understanding the relationships between them.
Exactly.
Now, the rise of cladistics was a major development.
It was a paradigm shift.
Okay. And the philosopher David Hull was actually involved in these debates,
He was, yeah.
offering insights into the methodology and implications.
He was a big part of it.
Wow. And this problem of phylogenetic inference.
Mm-hmm.
Experts